So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my company. So I've come over from England, so I'm going to do my best British accent for all of you. It's currently a heat wave in the UK, so I'm like really disappointed. It's thunderstorming here. It's very disappointing. I live on the beach, so it's the 1 week of the year that is actually nice in England I'm missing out on, which is really unfortunate for me. But I'm really excited. I've just done ISTE over in Chicago, and it's really excited to be invited to be here. So I'm just going to talk a bit about how I believe we can leverage AR to unlock the why of learning. So a little bit of background about Curoscope, about what we do. I'm sure most of you don't know what Curoscope does. You've never heard of us. So here is me going to try and impress you a little bit. We're pioneers, I guess, in the VR and AR space, for better or for worse. We created one of the most viewed VR experiences of all time. Some people may have seen this. It's been watched 30 or so million times to date. We also recently created, nobody knows about this, so I want to evangelize this a little bit, a book that introduces kids to virtual reality. You create your own viewer, and then you can go into space, into volcanoes, become the size of an insect. It's very, very cool. And we're perhaps better known now for the weird T-shirt that I'm wearing at the moment, which I can demo to you afterwards, but this is basically what it does. If you can see it somewhat closer, you point a phone or tablet at the T-shirt, and you can see inside the human body. It's the only way to learn about the human body on a human body. We don't want to talk about what the alternative is. It's not good. So we're trying to avoid the alternative and create a better world for kids where you can see inside the human body and learn about it in that way. And this is kind of consumer accessible at the moment. We sell it on Amazon, etc. So I guess why we start Curoscope, something I kind of believe very passionately about, is learning has to lead with why. This is something that I think I suffered with. I'm sure a lot of people suffered with this in school. When are we going to use this? And for me, this was learning French, learning Spanish, particularly languages for me for some reason. As a grown-up, I'm like, that's obviously a very naive, ridiculous view, but certainly in school, I didn't really understand. This is also a very English-speaking view of the world. I didn't understand why I needed to learn other languages. The same thing would apply for science, weirdly enough. I think science now is something that I'm obviously incredibly interested in, but actually when I was in school, I really struggled to find a way to connect with it. I never really understood why that particular thing was important to me. I'm now endlessly fascinated by the solar system, but it seemed so abstract and so surreal that I never really connected with it at school, and so my disciplines I learned at school may be quite relevant now, or actually were kind of like information technology and business studies and things like that, because I had kind of an ability to have a hands-on interaction with them. So it's my belief that, yes, you might get test scores without why, you might get results, but ultimately beyond that, you're never really getting somebody who really truly believes in something, really truly will not just learn about it in the context of a classroom, but will actually take it home and learn about it and not moan about the homework, but maybe actively go and explore it on their computer at home or wherever that may be. And also, and this is kind of where we come into the T-shirt and products like that, I'm firmly of the belief that learning must be relevant and contextual to the people you're learning about. We saw this in the talk earlier, like mathematics is something that is incredibly relevant to all of this and is something that actually you have to use in daily life. But at school, learning about mathematics is just moving numbers around on a page, and you never really understand the true purpose of what is going on. I believe that's the most critical thing you should be considering when you're talking about learning. So, slightly vested interest in augmented reality, but also being a kind of early adopter of the technology, I see it as partly my role to evangelize why I think it is interesting. For those of you who don't know what augmented reality is, like the kind of soft mass market version was Pokemon Go, but ultimately what augmented reality is doing is it's creating something digital in your environment, and this kind of mad science fiction visions of the future where we're all going to be in headsets, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that. It's merely a way of representing the 3D world in a space that is somewhat closer to the physical one. And I think that becomes kind of really important when you're talking about learning. So learning is typically incredibly hypothetical. If we talk about learning about the human body, typically the way you will learn about it is on a model, or it is on a video or images that are often incredibly disconnected from what you're actually learning about. So I remember learning about the human body, and you saw kind of endoscopes in the body, and you saw mad stuff going on, but ultimately you didn't ever really connect to the fact that that was you. It's incredibly abstract, it's incredibly hard to relate to, and that creates genuine disconnection. And I'm firmly of the belief, really, that one of the net results in that is that loads of people don't care about their fitness, loads of people don't care about what we eat, loads of people are very disconnected from what actually powers you. So augmented reality turns the impossible into the possible. This doesn't have to just be the human body. This can be representing geometry. This can be contextualizing mathematics. Augmented reality lets us visualize something in a 3D space. And for countless ways to learn, this is really, really important, to take it from a page and take it into something that you can actually actively interact with, mold, and scope the outcome. It brings a reality to concepts that could not exist before. So T-Shed is obviously a very good example of that. It's an example of seeing inside the body when you wouldn't have been able to see inside it before. But it could also be chemistry and actually understanding molecular structure. This is something that perhaps traditionally would require models, and perhaps a lot of classrooms in the US and the Western world can have these, but if we start to kind of look into the future, you can manipulate them, you can create things, you can create an accessibility of physical stuff without having to physically create it or physically purchase it. So actually it opens that completely up. So to sum up my fairly speedy talk, making something feel real can create the context and the relevance that unlocks long-term retained learning now that you understand why. If you understand why you are going into a subject, if you understand why it is important, you won't be like me, who doesn't know French and Spanish and hasn't interacted with those things. You'll be someone who truly is invested and involved in the subject at hand. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. That's a tough act to follow. VR in an English accent, but I'll try to do my best, especially since I'm talking about data. So I'm going to talk about a project that is known as GBL XAPI. There we go. All right, so some of you may be familiar with this game, and if you can take a look at this slide, you will notice that there are lots of islands. That is the state of our industry right now when it comes to learning data. We have millions of islands of data. There are a lot of different tribes. They don't talk to one another. And basically, the data sits in these proprietary systems where researchers really cannot reach it. So one of the things that we wanted to do was create a project that would fix this problem for the industry and make it open source. The first thing we did is we interviewed and went around the industry to find out what was going on, what did people want, the educators themselves, stakeholders, funders, et cetera. 94% of administrators said that GBL will not basically scale in the industry, and I think we're seeing that now, without data. But at the same time, we also found out that a lot of them didn't necessarily need data today. 90% of game developers actually told us that standardization would be important for moving this industry forward. That's an important fact and why we're actually here doing this project today. So what were some of our goals? What we wanted to do was create a new standard. We call it GBLX API. It was founded on an underpinning that I'll talk to you about in a minute. We wanted it to be interoperable, transparent, normalized data, simple to use, and flexible. Standards sometimes can be scary to people, but I can trust that by the time you see the end of this presentation, you'll find that it's easier than you may believe. So we've been at this for about 3+ years. This started as a lab project within Digit Games when we were looking at our own proprietary data system and realizing this wasn't going to scale, it wasn't going to go forward, it was built on an old system, we were going to have to do something new. So we fooled around with a underlying technology that was evolving called XAPI, and we said this is something we should do. And then we said we should do this for the community as a whole. So then we went to the National Science Foundation, we said, we think this would be a great project for you to invest in for the community itself. They agreed, they funded us for a phase 1 SBIR, and that led to a lot more development along to what GBLX API is today. It's an open source project, and it's also an XAPI community of practice for K-12 educational apps. Not just for games, but any digital educational app now. XAPI is an underlying technology for e-learning on how they collect data in much broader areas than just the K-12 educational format. It's JSON data, and we'll get to that in a minute. So what does that actually mean? XAPI as a structure is made up of a variety of different things: actor, verb, object, and contextual activities. Okay? I think that's fairly simple if many of you have collected information regarding events, no matter what it is, non-learning data or learning data. You can actually collect it with this XAPI structure. Where does GBLX APIs fit? There is the broader vocabulary for XAPI. What we did is we focused on the educational standards that existed in this community and then focused on the other things relevant for games. And that's where contextual activity actually became the important part of what we created as a controlled vocabulary for this industry. So the first thing we did is we actually looked at the educational standards out there: Next Generation Science Standards, Common Core, C3 Framework for Social Studies. And we sort of looked at what the commonality was across those areas, and we said, here are 6 core vocabulary types that we could create that are not just US-based standards, but could create an identifier within learning data that could be used globally. That became domain, subdomain, focus, skills, topic, and action. So how did we sort of get to that point? Well, if you look at this slide for domain, you'll see that there's an example for Common Core Math, Common Core ELA, Next Generation Science Standards, and Social Studies, where there was some hierarchy and structure within those standards that allowed us to find a common place to normalize data around domains. So the next question I sort of get at this point when I'm doing usually a longer presentation is, it's a standard. I don't like standards. It's going to constrict me. It's going to control me. It's not going to let me do the things that I want to do. Yes, you can customize this. This is extremely flexible. You can take it as deep as you want to with the way we've sort of looked at this, or you can take it as narrow as you want to. You can also layer it on top of what you already are doing. It's not a problem with respect to flexibility. So the next question I usually get is, how hard is this actually going to be to implement? So the process here is, as with any educational learning product, you're going to have to basically take your events and organize those and figure out what type of standards and learning objectives are associated with that. You can implement that with our API, put that into your game. We've actually created a Unity API that's available to the community as an open source product, and we're continuing to evolve on that. Next thing is you collect your data, that goes into a learning record store, and then you're going to create reports. What we actually did to prove out that this could be easy for others to implement, and it was one of our original project goals because of past projects and the time it would take for implementation, is to see that we could do this in a short period of time. So we actually took an RIT student, fresh out of school, put them in with one of our games and the events, and basically said, here, implement this in this game. He did it in a week, and then he built some reports after that. So it is doable. It's not going to take a huge amount of level of effort. One thing I wanted to point out here is the learning record store itself and a focus on the fact of the interoperable aspect of it. Learning record stores, there's a variety of them out there. Some are open source, community-based. We're providing one to the community for free as this project evolves. So you can use it, you can pilot with it. It can send data to more than one store. A learning record store is nothing but basically a database. So you can send it to one store, which could be the school district system itself, and then your own database as well. You can also then move it from one learning record store to another. So it's highly transportable. As long as you are following the XAPI specification, it'll move from one domain to another domain to another domain. So ultimately, what we wanted to see in the future was something from the National Science Foundation that we had proposed, where researchers could eventually have this data being brought together in a huge hub. And then for the industry as a whole, we could start to look at all of this data and actually find some interesting aspects from it. But we're never going to get there if we don't normalize our data to start with. So what are some of the other things that we found out when interviewing administrators? Non-learning data was extremely important to them. Believe it or not, the learning data was not as important as the non-learning data. They weren't going to buy products and continue to use them if they didn't know how often they were actually being used. 100% of the administrators said they needed to see the non-learning data, when it was being used, how often, et cetera. 70% then said they were interested in the granular learning data. So when it comes down to reports, today I would just say, if you want to get into this, you can start just by collecting the data. If you want to go to the next level, then you can start reporting it out. We've provided a reporting server that everybody can use to try and take this data and then create your own reports. Ultimately, we would love to create some standardized reports that everybody could use. But you're going to find that you can probably get a lot more data out of here than you've originally been doing it with a lot of your own systems. The other thing I will say is that you're now in control of your data. If you're putting your data into Unity Analytics, you don't have your data. You have some reports. If you put it to Google Analytics, sort of the same thing, and on and on and on. And then if you have a proprietary system, you're having to really maintain that, and you're sort of sitting in your own island of automation. This is going to provide you a lot more flexibility and fluidity. So who are the stakeholders that are going to benefit from this? This really can affect our industry in a broad sense of a way. I've listed here just 6 stakeholders that can all benefit from this. And one thing I would say to many of us as game developers is that if you think it's challenging to get funded, think about how the funders feel when you can't give them data to show that what they invested in actually had results, okay? If we want to grow this industry, we need to provide all these stakeholders data that's important to them. Okay, one of the other things I wanted to point out too is that we in this industry have had some very broad ideas. Personalized learning is one of those. How are we going to get to that space? Some of us have made significant efforts into that area, but we haven't really found that panacea, okay? One of the reasons is data. These systems need data to be fed. AI, machine learning, a lot of these types of systems. One thing that's a benefit of the XAPI system is its natural language, JSON. Machines can read it. It actually says, this is what the quiz was. This is how they responded. All that data is actually in there. It's not zeros and ones sitting in some database. Okay. So a lot of people have seen systems, whether they be portals, other reporting systems, those types of things come and go. Is this really flash in the pan? Well, the one thing I will say is one reason why we developed this on XAPI is because XAPI is not a flash in the pan. It's being used by government agencies. It's being spec'd into the organizations. It's replacing SCORM as the e-learning specification going forward. So even if GBL XAPI sort of withers in the wind for a while, XAPI is always going to be there. It's something you're going to be able to count on. It's not an investment that you're going to waste time on. So the one thing I'd like to say to everybody is that we've talked about a lot of data. There are people that I know that have gone to the White House during the Obama administration or previous other administrations and talked about learning data in this field. We're still talking about it. It's time to actually act and do something about it. So let's stop kicking the can down the road. The one thing that we've done at Digit is we've continued the work that we invested in with the National Science Foundation, and we've put up a learning record store, and we put up a reporting server so that all of you can start your pilots on this free of charge. And we'll also provide some assistance on the development side to get you up and running with the Unity API. And that's all I have for that.
Good morning. Is it morning still? Good morning. Good afternoon. Women's median earnings are less than men's, despite academic achievements. And the greater the academic achievement, the higher the gap becomes. If I could have all of the men in the audience raise their hands. If I could have all remaining audience participants assist me with simulating the gender pay gap by paying each male, each raised hand, $10. Cash App, Venmo, PayPal? Okay, you can put your hands down. If we were playing a round of factuality, I would have asked Brian, Rich, Mason, and Justin to raise their hands, and I would have asked all the remaining characters to pay them a specified amount because we're demonstrating the gender pay gap. A couple of years ago, I found myself reimagining what the game of Monopoly would look like if we showed up as ourselves, as opposed to boots and cars and hats and wheelbarrows. And then this random search led me to looking on Google. It's all right. And I looked on Google for this game that could pull in all these various things about structural inequality, and I couldn't find it on Google, which means it doesn't exist, right? So then I turned to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which reported out largely on 4 racial groups, and I understand that this is limited, but the groups were Asian, white, black, and Hispanic, although my preferred term is Latinx as it encompasses all genders. I decided I was going to have men and women, which is a great segue into the introduction of my characters here. Also on this chart at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they also identified, in addition to race and gender, they also identified income. It's a common misconception that white men have the highest income in this country. It's actually Asian men, statistically speaking. Our first character here is Brian, Asian male, who begins the game of factuality with $1,700. Following Brian is Rich, white male, he's also gay, and begins the game with $1,600. Next to Rich is Chloe, Asian woman. She wears a hijab, she's Muslim, and begins the game with $1,500. Next to Chloe is Emma, white woman, also Jewish, who begins the game with $1,400. Mason, African-American male, who begins the game with $1,300. Following Mason is Layla, African-American woman, transgender, who begins the game with $1,200. Next to Layla is Justin, Latinx male, who begins the game with $1,100, and Sophia, Latinx woman, who begins the game with $1,000. In order to demonstrate accessibility, the characters also play the game in the order of their income, which is a great segue into what game are they playing? Well, on this board here. I hope you can see from where you're seated that the first 2 quarters of the board, so following the payday/start square, the first 2 quarters of the board are outlined in red. That's because those areas are previously redlined. Redlining is the process of denying African American and Jewish people the right to obtain property in desirable locations. So what we're looking at is the origin of the issue, but the evolution of the policy. So the evolution of the policy would make it challenging for Black and brown communities to move out of these areas. So for that reason, Mason, Layla, Justin, and Sophia can only secure property in the first 2 quarters of the board. All other characters can purchase property anywhere they would like on the board due to gentrification of originally redlined neighborhoods and areas, generational wealth, and higher income. You'll also notice on the board that there are 3 prison squares. Every time that Justin and Mason roll and land on a prison square, they automatically go to prison because we are capturing the ways in which black and brown male bodies are racially profiled and over-policed in society. Throughout the duration of the game, I will pause at about every minute or so, and I will read a statistic about racial, class, sexual orientation, gender, and faith-based discrimination. We dive deeper into prison and bail disparities. We also explore and go deeper into redlining and gentrification. It touches upon education and equity, mental illness, the healthcare system overall, and we also explore how all these areas intersect. The beauty of this game is that it's a simulation. All participants are required to select a character that differs from how they identify, just to get a better understanding of the life experience of a different walk of life. This game evokes emotion. I hear sometimes people who are playing certain characters saying, I hate this game. And that's perfect. It's designed to make you feel that way. It's supposed to evoke emotion. Whereas people on the first 4 characters are really excited to have money. I hear people in the group sometimes saying it feels good to be a man today. Also, by design. Just wanted people to have an experience of something that's different, because I notice in conversations about race, which is largely my background as a higher education administrator as well, that when you show up as yourself, it's more challenging to engage in the conversation. But if you are engaging in a simulation, it's easier to immerse yourself in the subject matter. My name is Natalie Gillard. I am the creator of Factuality, and I thank you for listening.
Okay, hello. So last year, 2 of my colleagues and I have worked on a game-based learning program in a selected sample of Jordanian public schools around gamifying pedagogy in grade 9 math classrooms. When we hear game-based learning, most of us probably jump to the idea of using digital technology in the classroom. However, digital technology in the classrooms. However, analog games, in fact, can be as valuable as digital games. In developing countries, the rhetoric goes as follows. Most of our schools are actually not equipped with the right infrastructure, let alone technology. So here's the catch with game-based learning. Schools do not need connectivity. They do not need internet in order for us to be able to employ game-based learning approaches. So analog games, as I said, can be as valuable and as valuable as digital games. They can also sometimes be cheaper to implement and easier to execute. According to evidence, game-based learning has been proven to impact student learning outcomes as well as motivation levels. And in fact, it is the features of game-based learning that are the reasoning behind these positive outcomes. Those features include cognitive engagement, scaffolding at the student attainment level, formative and ongoing feedback, as well as the low-stakes assessments that are linked to game-based learning in the classroom. As a result, the Queen Rania Foundation seeks to improve student learning outcomes through affordable, teacher-targeted, localized, innovative solutions. And any intervention that we work on has to focus on 3 main areas, either literacy, numeracy, or socio-emotional skill development. We decided to target numeracy through game-based learning because of the strong evidence in this domain. And to give you a little bit more about the local context in Jordan, how students are performing in international assessments, in fact, almost 2/3 of 15-year-old students perform below the OECD average, according to the PISA, which is the international student assessment. So the majority of math students are actually low performers in math. They also report low levels of self-concept in math and high math anxiety. According to PISA, 35% of the students actually feel helpless when doing a math problem. And 51% of the boys, they get very nervous when doing or solving a mathematical problem. Also, a McKinsey report has shown that student mindsets have actually tripled the effect of socioeconomic background on PISA outcomes. Therefore, it's actually very critical to target student mindsets, especially in developing countries such as Jordan, in order to help students improve and get better scores on PISA assessments. When it comes to the teachers, also teachers in Jordan, they do not employ the student-centered active learning and teaching methodology. Approximately 40% of the students reported never or sometimes receiving feedback from their teachers in the classroom. So given all of this evidence, QRF decided to pilot an intervention that gamified pedagogy in grade 9 math classrooms. And as you can see from the theory of change, which is shown on the screen, the program ultimately aims to improve student math outcomes by changing both teacher and student mindsets through applying game-based learning and through developing game-based teaching materials that are aligned with the learning objectives of the national curriculum in Jordan. So to walk you through the pilot components, we designed the program to include two main components. First of all, we had the games, and second, we had the teacher training model. We developed a total of 9 games. As you can see, some of them are included on the screen. But for the sake of time and for the purposes of this presentation, I will be explaining only one, which is called My Memory, FACTUALITY in Arabic. So this is actually similar to any memory game that you probably heard about. Students through this game should be able to learn the laws of exponents and to be able to solve exponential equations. So essentially, we have 4 decks of cards, 1 for each level. And in each deck, we have cards with identical values. The game is played in pairs, so we have 2 members. And each student flips 2 cards, one after the other, in turn. When the student flips the card, they try to solve the equation or the question that is on the card, as you can see here. And if he's able to match 2 cards, then he would receive 3 points. And the second player would get 2 points in return. And the winner of the game basically is the player with the largest number of pairs, who collects the largest number of pairs. Level 2 is actually played in the same way, but before proceeding to level 3 and 4, students, the groups, they need to be restructured first, so that we make sure that all students play all together in the classroom. Moving on to the second component of the program, which is the teacher training. We designed the teacher training model to include high-impact components, including teacher-student simulation, follow-up support by Ministry of Education supervisors, as well as regular professional learning community meetings. The purpose of those meetings would be to encourage the teachers to share their experiences, to share their feedback, and to improve their teaching through collective thinking. However, carrying out the teacher training model as planned was a bit difficult. First of all, the classroom observations were not actually conducted by math teachers, which meant that the teachers did not, which meant that the feedback was more general rather than specific, rather than content related. Second of all, the supervisors that we recruited from the Ministry of Education, they had very busy schedules, which meant that they were not able to provide the teachers with the sufficient support. Third, when we tested the games prior to the launch of the program, we did not have the prototypes ready on time, so we did not carry out proper simulations. And finally, we did not have a content validation framework for the games, which meant that the games were not validated in terms of the leveling, in terms of the differentiation, and in terms of the pacing. In addition to all of this, we also encountered several challenges during implementation. The main ones included convincing teachers that those games can actually be played by all students across all achievement levels and not just exceptional students. Second, it was and still is very challenging to change teachers' mindsets around the value of game-based learning in math. In fact, in Jordan, math is perceived as a very strict and a very hard or difficult subject. One of the teachers that we worked with in the first semester, he actually refused to implement any of the games that we developed in his classroom. He even complained that we belittled the subject by introducing games in the classroom. So changing mindsets is actually very difficult. And finally, we also struggled with promoting a growth mindset to the teachers. So given all of this, moving forward, one thing that we learned and one thing that we should do is make sure that the content, all the game content is validated before we move to an RCT phase. Before I end up my presentation, I would like to show you a very brief video documenting the implementation or the use of games in the classroom. Please note that this teacher that will show on the videos was actually one of the best teachers that we worked with. Also, the students that she worked with reported higher levels of motivation and higher levels of excitement towards math, according to the focus groups that we carried out with those students. Thank you.